We are now going to have a presentation by Kyle Boyd, the title, Visibility for Disability Digitization Project.
Hello, my name is Kyle Boyd, and I am the project coordinator for the Visibility for Disability Digitization Project at UMass Amherst Special Collections and University Archives. Today I will be talking about the goals of the project and some of the challenges we have encountered along the way. The 2-year Visibility for Disability Digitization Project is funded by the Council on Library and Information Resources Digitizing Hidden Collections grant. We will be making 55,000 items from 19 of our disability collections, freely available online through our digital repository, Credo, the Digital Commonwealth, and the Digital Public Library of America. These items will explore the experience of disability in the United States and the evolution of the disability rights movement. UMass Special Collections has been actively digitizing material for over a decade. In 2009, we began developing our digital repository while working on a project to digitize the entirety of the W.E.B. Du Bois papers. Since then, we have continuously added material through a variety of large and small digitization projects. Today, we have almost 250,000 items available online. Over the years, we have developed an efficient workflow to complete projects. We hire a team of undergraduate student assistants who scan the material and a group of metadata assistants who create descriptive metadata for the items. UMass Special Collections collects material relating to the history of UMass, New England, entrepreneurship, and social change. We collect material from a variety of interconnected social change movements rather than focusing on a specific movement. The wide range of topics includes the anti-nuclear movement, intentional communities, environmental activism, creative aging, and labor activism. Over the past decade, our disability rights collections have grown. Today, we have over 30 collections relating to the experience of disability and the disability rights movement. This is one of the largest collections of archival disability rights material in the country. These collections cover many topics, including deaf education, the fight for physical accessibility, the Paralympics, the psychiatric survivors movement, the AIDS crisis, and deinstitutionalization. Since announcing this grant, we have received more disability rights collections from people and organizations who have heard about this project. We selected 19 of our collections to focus on for this digitization project. These collections include both personal papers of activists and institutional records. I will be going into more detail about some of the collections that we are digitizing during this project. The Hudson Family Papers covers 5 generations of physicians and social reformers. Erasmus Darwin Hudson, the patriarch of the family, was an orthopedic surgeon and an abolitionist. In the 1840s, he worked as a lecturing agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society. He traveled around the northeastern United States talking about slavery and wrote articles for anti-slavery publications. As an orthopedic surgeon, he worked to improve artificial limb technology, which contributed to the development of the modern prosthesis. During the Civil War, thousands of soldiers lost limbs. Hudson earned a commission from the Surgeon General to care for the wounded soldiers in New York City. His son, Erasmus Darwin Hudson Jr., became a thoracic physician and educator. In their correspondence, the father and son often discussed medicine. In one letter, Hudson Jr. talks to his father about the proper way to measure an arm for a prosthesis, noting that the arm changes size if it is flexed or extended. In 1862, 4-year-old Mabel Hubbard became deaf from scarlet fever. At that time, all schools for the deaf taught children to communicate through sign language. Mabel's father, Gardiner Green Hubbard, believed that his daughter could speak and learn like hearing children. In 1867, Hubbard established the Clark School for the Deaf, which was the first school in the United States to teach deaf children to speak and lip read rather than sign language. They were a pioneer in oral deaf education. To this day, the Clark School differs philosophically from other schools, including the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, which teaches children using American Sign Language. The Clark School was also a leader in the training of teachers. They started a formal teacher education program in 1889 and teamed up with Smith College in 1962 to offer a master's in deaf education. Alexander Graham Bell started teaching at the school in 1871. He later married Mabel Hubbard and was an advocate for the Clark School and oral deaf education throughout his life. He used the funds from inventing the telephone to found the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, which supports oral education throughout the world. The Alexander Graham Bell Association and the Clark School have been closely connected throughout the years due to their shared interest in oral education. The Clark School for the Deaf Records provides rich documentation of the 150-year history of the school and their advocacy for oral deaf education. It includes everything from a complete set of annual reports to the records of the International Conference on Oral Education of the Deaf and the Alumni Association's correspondence. In 1917, the American Red Cross and Jeremiah Milbank, heir to a condensed milk fortune, founded the nation's first outpatient rehabilitation center. The International Center for the Disabled initially focused on World War I veterans before expanding their services to all people with disabilities in 1920. The ICD's threefold mission was to assist people with disabilities in becoming self-supporting, prevent the dependence on public charity, and promote the public understandings of disability. One of their main goals was to prepare people for employment. Their approach focused on workplace adaptations rather than by training people for specific jobs. Clients took classes in a variety of fields, including sewing machine repair, jewelry making, and linotype printing. Training people for employment continues to be their core mission, and today they continue that work as the Institute for Career Development. In addition to vocational training, clients participated in many recreational activities, including an annual boat ride, graduation ceremonies, and holiday parties. In addition to administrative records, the collection includes thousands of photographs which document ICD's work over the years, including vocational training, the annual boat ride, visits by officials and celebrities, and graduation ceremonies. One of my favorite photos is the one on the left of this slide, which shows a woman in a specialized wheelchair, which includes an umbrella, water cooler, fan, magazine holder, and a vanity to do her makeup. The Belchertown State School was founded in 1922 to provide long-term care for persons with developmental disabilities. The school operated without public scrutiny for decades, until the 1960s when reports of deplorable conditions appeared in the Boston Globe and other newspapers. In 1972, Ben Ritchie, on behalf of his son Robert Ritchie, filed a class action lawsuit against the school. The school eventually closed in 1992 after decades of lawsuits. The Friends Association was originally established in 1954 to promote improved conditions at the school. Ben Ritchie served as president in the 1970s, including during the time when he filed his lawsuit. Rappaport was an endocrinologist and psychopathologist. He studied at the University of Paris and then emigrated to the United States after World War II. While at the University of Wisconsin, he studied the social aspects of mental disorders and juvenile delinquency. In 1956, he discovered a statistical correlation between the incidences of Down syndrome and exposure to fluorides. His work was widely cited by opponents of fluoridation and was criticized by proponents. Bob and Martha Persk have been advocating for people with intellectual disabilities for the past 5 decades. They worked together at the Kansas Neurological Institute, which provided care to 250 children with intellectual disabilities. While serving as a chaplain, Bob wrote his first article on ministry and intellectual disabilities. Since then, Bob has been the author of 16 books and hundreds of articles. Martha has worked as an illustrator and editor of many of these books. The Persks also work to end institutionalization of persons with disabilities. Bob served as the executive director of the Greater Omaha Association for Retarded Citizens, which created one of the earliest community-based organizations in the nation. Bob became an advocate for people with intellectual disabilities in prison. In 2002, he was honored for his advocacy work when he became the only non-lawyer to receive the American Bar Association's Paul Hearn Award for services to persons with disabilities. Cynthia Miller was a psychiatric survivor, feminist, lesbian, and writer. In 1976, she became a member of Project Release, which worked to free present and former psychiatric patients from social injustice. Project Release was part of the first wave of ex-patient organizations formed to oppose forced institutionalization and psychiatric oppression. Miller's collection focuses on the early history of the psychiatric survivors movement. It contains her own writings, as well as many disability publications, including Phoenix Rising and Project Release. Judy Chamberlain was a pioneer in the psychiatric survivors movement. Inspired by other movements, including the civil rights movement, second wave feminism, and gay liberation, psychiatric survivors fought to gain respect for their human rights. This included fights against involuntary hospitalizations, forced treatment, electroshock, and the label of, quote, mental patients. Chamberlain was involved in many advocacy organizations, including the Mental Patients Liberation Front, National Empowerment Center, Mental Patients Resistance, National Alliance of Mental Patients, and the Ruby Rogers Advocacy and Drop-In Center. In 1978, Chamberlain wrote On Our Own, Patient-Controlled Alternatives to the Mental Health System, which proposed an alternative environment where ex-patients operated their own support system without the oversight of mental health professionals. In the 1980s, Chamberlain started to participate in more public speaking engagements. She traveled around the world discussing her experiences as a psychiatric survivor and her book. Starting in the 1990s, Chamberlain participated more in cross-disability advocacy work. She found many parallels between psychiatric survivors and people with physical disabilities. In 2000, she contributed to the Federal Report of the National Council of Disability, which was a benchmark in cross-disability activism. Chamberlain's papers covers 40 years of the psychiatric survivors and disability rights movements. Luckily, she kept everything, and we therefore have a very thorough record of her activism. This includes correspondence with hundreds of survivors and allies, including many prominent members of the movement. Records of the many conferences that she attended and organizations that she participated in. Chamberlain also kept publications by disability rights groups, including In a Nutshell and Mouth Magazine. Ray Unziger was a psychiatric survivor, public servant, and disability civil rights activist. She spent her life advocating for equal rights for psychiatric patients, including the right to decide if and how they receive treatment. In the early 1970s, she wrote a memoir titled You Never Gave Me M&Ms, which recounted her stays in mental hospitals. The last chapters of her book can be seen as a manifesto for the South Dakota Mental Health Advocacy Project, which she founded in 1979. Unziger advocated for the rights of mental health patients for the rest of her life. She spoke at conferences around the world and appeared on multiple television shows. She also ran unsuccessfully for a position in the South Dakota House of Representatives. She continued to be an advocate for people with disabilities in America and was appointed to the National Council on Disability in 1995. She then became the president of the National Association for Rights, Protections, and Advocacy in 1997. Many of the collections in this project overlap because activists work together to solve common problems. Ray Unziger and Judy Chamberlain were friends and fellow activists in the psychiatric survivors movement. There is overlap between their collections as they wrote each other's letters and dealt with similar issues. This overlap adds tremendous value because we were able to see multiple perspectives on the same issue or event. Lucy Gwynn was sent to the New Mexico Brain Rehabilitation Center after suffering a traumatic brain injury due to a car crash. After witnessing a world of isolation, patient abuse, and powerlessness, she escaped from the center. She then worked to expose the conditions at New Mexico and was able to shut the facility down. Gwynn became a powerful voice in all disability advocacy. She was the founder, designer, and editor of Mouth Magazine, which ran bi-monthly from 1990 to 2009. Mouth Magazine was an influential disability rights-focused magazine that discussed a wide range of topics, including housing, finances, healthcare, the legal system, and more. Denise Carruth and Fred Pelka are activists and historians of the disability rights movement. Carruth worked to secure accessible and affordable mass transit in Massachusetts. She has also been involved with a broad spectrum of disability campaigns and organizations. Carruth's partner, Fred Pelka, has written multiple books on disability issues over the years. Paul Kahn was an artist, writer, and activist for people with disabilities. He was also involved in the independent living movement and was a pioneer in advocating for personal care assistance. Kahn also worked as a member of the Massachusetts Governor's Advisory Commission on Disability Policy. His collections contains many of his writings, including plays, essays, poems, and articles, as well as issues of the newsletter Disability Issues, which he was the editor of. His collection also contains hundreds of photographs and videos of his childhood and travels around the world. Elmer C. Bartels was the commissioner of the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission for 30 years. He was a national leader on issues relating to vocational rehabilitation and independent living for people with disabilities. He helped to found the Massachusetts Association of Paraplegics, the Massachusetts Council of the Handicapped, and the Boston Center for Independent Living. With these organizations, he worked on a number of issues including architectural barriers, employment, and housing for people with disabilities. Silvio O. Conte was the representative for the 1st District of Massachusetts in the United States House of Representatives for 30 years. The 1st District covers most of western Massachusetts. His time in office covered a significant period of American history, including the HIV/AIDS crisis and the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Included in his papers are issue books, talking points, campaign materials, and speeches. His collection covers all of the legislation that he was involved with, but for our project we focused on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Conte was one of the members of Congress who introduced the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1989. His records include fact sheets, drafts, analysis, and correspondence which showed the evolution of the ADA until it passed in 1990. During his years in office, Conte produced a weekly 15-minute radio program, which updated his constituents about the work he was doing in Washington. He talked about his legislative initiatives and issues facing the 1st District. For example, in an August 1982 radio show, he discussed how people with disabilities were being dropped from Social Security. A constituent had contacted Conte after being informed that his benefits had been terminated. Conte introduced legislation to slow down the Social Security disability review process and require the Social Security Administration to prove medical improvement before discontinuing benefits. The Boston AIDS Consortium was established in 1988 to address the needs of people at risk of or living with HIV/AIDS in the Boston area. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the Boston AIDS Consortium worked to coordinate the allocation and distribution of the Ryan White Care Act funds to the greater Boston area. The Ryan White Care Act of 1990 was the largest federally funded program in the United States for people living with HIV/AIDS. The CARE Act distributed money to municipalities who then decided how best to use the funds to improve care for people living with HIV/AIDS. The majority of this collection is transcripts of public hearings and the Planning Council discussions about how funds should be distributed and spent. The transcripts include testimonies from healthcare providers and consumers. They also discuss how to identify needs of communities and the local organizations that are in need of funding. Kevin McVeigh is an anti-nuclear activist and HIV/AIDS advocate. In the 1970s, he became active in the anti-nuclear and environmental movements. He helped to found the Pelican Alliance, a nonviolent civil disobedience organization that opposed nuclear power plant construction. He also co-founded InterHelp, a network of anti-nuclear activists and educators. In the late 1980s, he shifted his focus to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. He founded the AIDS Community Group of Franklin County and worked with many other related organizations, including Tapestry Health, Massachusetts HIV Prevention Planning Group, and the Massachusetts Association of Title II HIV Care Coordinators. As part of this work, he advocated for local organizations to receive Ryan White Care Act funds through the Franklin County North Quadrant AIDS Consortium. Together, the McVeigh collection and the Boston AIDS Consortium records show how different parts of Massachusetts handled the HIV/AIDS crisis and the distribution of funds. McVeigh's collection focuses on providing health care for people in rural communities, which involves different challenges than in the city environment. As you all know, we cannot scan everything, so we have to select what will be digitized and what will not. For this project, we tried to select a substantial amount from each of the 19 collections rather than a sampling of materials. This means that we will digitize all of the correspondence instead of selecting specific letters. We will select folders or even whole boxes to scan rather than making the decision for individual items. The amount we selected from each collection varies since they range in size from 2 linear feet to 195 linear feet. The larger collections, which includes the Clark School for the Deaf, International Center for the Disabled, Judy Chamberlain, and Caruth Pelka papers, will make up a large amount of the digitized material. When selecting material to use, we try to select material that has a strong research value, is visually interesting, or is unique. We don't have a rubric for deciding what to select, but there are certain genres that we love to include. Reports and publications provide a backbone for research by providing regular updates of an organization's work. Writings, including articles, essays, and speeches, provide the perspective of individual people. Correspondence gives a first-hand account of an event or topic. It is often more authentic than writings since it hasn't been edited the way publications or other writings have. Correspondence also shows the relationship between people as you read their letters over time. Photographs and audiovisual material are visually interesting and can often tell us a whole story. As the saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Ephemera, including news clippings, flyers, brochures, and other material, can provide extra perspectives and information. Together, these materials can tell a more complete story of the disability rights movement. We are using mods as well as in-house guidelines to create descriptive metadata. While these provide many standards to follow, there are some unique challenges when working with disability collections. I will go into more detail about some of these challenges in the following slides. Privacy is a major consideration for this project since most of the material is modern and deals with sensitive topics. There are many factors we consider when deciding what to include and how to describe an item. We don't have strict rules, but instead take a variety of things into consideration when making decisions. First, we consider the creator of the materials. Items created by the primary creator of a collection are normally okay to digitize. When donating their collections, the creators indicated what could and could not be scanned in their deed of gift. This gives us a good starting point in deciding what we can make available online and what we cannot. Next, we think about whether something was published or was designed for the public to use. Newsletters, flyers, brochures, and other things that were always meant for public consumption typically do not have any privacy concerns. Next, we think about the content of the material. A detailed account of an experience by a third party in a mental institution would be treated differently from a quick letter confirming travel plans. We also think about the age of an item. Was it created last year or 50 years ago? The older the item is, the more likely we are to include it. When there are third parties involved, either as creators or mentioned, we focus on three things. First is if their full name is being used. If a letter refers to someone named Katie, but doesn't give any more identifiable information about the person, then their privacy is still being protected. On the other hand, if a full name is being used, or if the person has a very unique first name, then the item would be easily findable by anyone searching for that person on Google. Next, we take into account if the person is still alive. If the person is deceased, then we are more likely to include the material. We also take into account whether or not the person was public about their disability. If the person passed away and was a well-known disability advocate, then we are more likely to include their material. In the case of Judy Chamberlain's correspondence, we predominantly included only the letters written by her. When we could find a living correspondent's contact information, we reached out to them to ask if we could include their letters as well. Most of the time, they were interested in the project and happy to have their letters included. For example, the letter on this slide was written by psychiatric survivor Sally Zinman and talks about a presentation she gave about mental health alternatives. Sally is still active in the movement and gave us her permission to digitize the letters written by her. Most of the decisions we made regarding privacy were judgment calls. We would look at an individual item and weigh all of the above factors. We want to make as much material available online as possible, but we also don't want to violate anyone's privacy while doing that. We try our best to respect people's privacy, but we do have a takedown policy, and if anyone ever has any concerns over an item, we can always remove it from our website quickly. The language we use when creating descriptive metadata is important. Our general rule of thumb is to use inclusive language. With this project, inclusive language focuses on people-first language, which refers to the person first and their disability second. For example, saying a person with disabilities rather than a disabled person, or saying someone uses a wheelchair rather than saying that they are wheelchair bound. Next, we try to use the terminology that people use to describe themselves. Many of the items in this project were created by persons with disability, and therefore we know the terminology and phrases that they use to describe themselves. When we know the term that people prefer, we use that term. In the case of the Clark School for the Deaf, we know the term that the school used to describe students, but we do not know what term each individual student preferred. The deaf and hard of hearing community is diverse, but according to the National Association of the Deaf, the most commonly accepted terms today are deaf with a lowercase d, deaf with an uppercase d, and hard of hearing, rather than the phrase person who is deaf, or other person-first phrases. There is also a difference between a capital D deaf and a lowercase d deaf. Capital D deaf refers to members of the deaf community who share a language, American Sign Language, as well as a culture. The Clark School does not use American Sign Language, and they use a lowercase d deaf in all of their writings. Therefore, we used the lowercase d deaf when talking about the Clark School. However, searching in our digital repository is not case sensitive. Therefore, you will find all spellings of the word deaf when you search. Another language challenge is historical terminology. Terminology used to discuss people with disabilities has changed over the years. We are working with collections that range from 200 years old to a few years old. The terminology has continuously changed over the years, and people have used the terminology of their time, but today some of those terms are considered outdated while others are considered offensive. Generally, we convert historical terms to their modern counterpart, and we use the modern terminology in description. One exception to this is the use of historical terminology within the name of an organization. We will often use the name of the organization at the time if it is in the title of the document, for example, in official annual reports. And then we use a standardized name for the name authority file, which links everything together. For example, both the Clark School and ICD have changed their names over the years to reflect contemporary conventions. The Clark School started in 1867 as the Clark Institution for Deaf Mutes. In 1896, they changed their name to the Clark School for the Deaf, and recently they changed their name to the Clark School for Hearing and Speech. Their name authority file is Clark School for the Deaf, since was their name for their longest period of time. ICD is another organization that has changed its name a few times, yet has retained the same acronym. In 1919, it started as the Institute for Crippled and Disabled Men, then switched to the Institute for the Crippled and Disabled. They then changed their name to the International Center for the Disabled, and today they are the Institute for Career Development. Their name authority file is the International Center for the Disabled, which they were for the longest time. We use the Library of Congress subject headings to co-locate materials, but they are not always sufficient. If there is not a sufficient LCSH heading, then we create a local heading. This can sometimes be difficult when different members of a group may prefer different terms, but we want to co-locate material from that movement. For example, members of the psychiatric survivors movement have different preferred terms, including psychiatric survivor, ex-patient, ex-inmate, or consumer. Some activists use the phrase consumer/survivor/ex-patient movement, but that is quite long and bulky. We selected the term psychiatric survivors as our primary term since it appears to be the most commonly used term within our collections. We use the other terms within the abstract of the item, which is then keyword searchable. But we use the term psychiatric survivors movement as the subject to link everything together. Our goal is to make the material digitized in this project available to the widest possible audience, regardless of ability. We recently redesigned our website, focused on accessibility, and underwent an audit from the UMass Assistive Technology Center to ensure that our online sites were accessible. Our metadata records and descriptive content are also available for the public to use without restrictions under a Creative Commons license. All digital objects are also available for non-commercial and educational use. Individual items do not have full text searchability. Most of the items are handwritten or have typefaces that are hard to accurately OCR. We are digitizing a small amount of audiovisual material, and all of those items will have captions when we describe them. This semester, we created an exhibit highlighting our disability collections, which is on display in our library. Material from a wide range of our disability rights collections showed the evolution of the disability rights movement. This exhibit is placed in one of the busiest parts of the library. Therefore, we hope that the exhibit will be able to reach people who were unaware of our collections. The exhibit has only been on display for a few weeks and has received positive feedback so far. We are aware that the physical exhibit may not be accessible to everyone. Therefore, we are in the process of creating an accessible online exhibit which will mirror the physical exhibit. When we applied for this grant a few years ago, we did not anticipate a global pandemic in the middle of it. As you all know, COVID-19 has disrupted our daily lives. UMass employees are currently working remotely to help flatten the curve. The health and safety of our employees and communities obviously comes first, but we are aware that this will also impact the project. We are currently about halfway through our 2-year project. Since we are working remotely for the foreseeable future, the scanning portion of our workflow has been interrupted. Since we do not know how long we will be social distancing, it is unclear how this will affect the timeline and results of this project. In conclusion, our goals for this project are to create a freely available and accessible digital foundation to explore the experience of disability and the evolution of the disability rights movement. Along the way, we are addressing the challenges that come with this project, including privacy, language choices, and proper subject headings. Thank you all for coming to my talk. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. There are questions. Give me a second here. Okay, so the first question is, in conducting this work, what did you find the most moving and the most disturbing? And now I'm adding, have you had to do self-care due to the content of the materials you're working with?
Okay, that's a good question. Let's see. Okay, I'm trying to think off the top of my head what is the most moving and most disturbing. But I'll first answer the self-care one, both for me and the employee.
Kyle, can you please speak up?
Oh, sorry, I have to hold the microphone up here. Forgot about that. Yes, so I'll first answer the self-care portion of that. For both me and the people who are creating the descriptive metadata, we are seeing a wide range of things. And so we try to be aware of that and give ourselves breaks. And then also we're trying to do switch back and forth between different collections. So we're not doing all of the psychiatric survivors at once and then really getting into that headspace. And so hopefully by going back and forth between other collections that might be a little bit easier for our own mental space, we give ourselves the breaks we need. Because for example, some of the Silvio Conte papers, they're much drier in the sense that they're not personal experiences. So those are a little easier to deal with, whereas like the psychiatric survivor collections, which are often dealing with people's really emotional experiences, those can become very heavy for us all to deal with. So trying to balance between different types of materials and different amounts of emotional things helps our headspace.
Thank you. Sorry. Do you have a good resource for vocabulary, a disability thesaurus perhaps?
We don't have one. We kind of are working on our, internally we use a shared document to track what terms we're using, but we haven't created one for the public to use.
Okay. Thank you. This is a question from Keisha Tracy. I am working with students to create an exhibit on disability heritage in Pittsburgh. Do you have suggestions about how to emphasize the localness of disability heritage?
Let's see. For the example, for our exhibit, we focused a lot on UMass student experiences. So I'm not sure if you guys have this experiences of people in your area. And essentially we looked at how UMass has reacted to things like that and to disability and accessibility over the years. So I would look at your area, your local area, and local organizations to see what they're doing.
Thank you. This question is from Al Stanton Hagen. Have you thought about using alternate strategies to make textual materials accessible? And then I will also add on, have you made oral or visual materials accessible with alternate strategies?
Yeah, so we haven't explored alternate strategies for images. For AV materials, which we are in the process of digitizing, they're being digitized offsite. We will be creating captions for those and transcripts.
Okay. Thank you. The questions are coming in ferociously. This is a question from Alexandra de Graffenried. How are you dealing with the offensive legacies of current LCSH terminology? I know a lot of the current terms have roots which are now considered offensive and ableist.
Yeah, so we're taking that on a case-by-case basis. When we feel like we need to create a term, we do. Yeah, it's a case-by-case basis of essentially deciding terms that are outdated versus offensive. We might use an outdated one, but try not to use the offensive ones if possible. But we still want to loop everything together. So it's a case-by-case basis. Unfortunately, that's not the best answer, but we take it one thing at a time.
This is a question from N. Creechley. When dealing with organizations that have changed names multiple times, some with outdated terminology, have you chosen to use a name different than the Library of Congress Name Authority?
For the actual name authority to loop everything together, we haven't. We haven't chosen to use a separate name. Within the abstract, we often use a shortened name. For example, the Clark School, we'll just call it Clark School in the abstract instead of spelling out the whole name. And so that's one way to do it. But most of the time, the name authority files are okay.
Okay. A question from Keisha Tracy. Are you planning on adding any other parts of the exhibit to relate to COVID-19 and disability?
We haven't thought about that yet. That's a good question, though. We're still adapting to just working from home and trying to keep up with the project, but that is a good thing to think about.
Another question, since searching is not case sensitive, is there a way for researchers to search for one term and exclude the other? The example given, capital D def versus lowercase def.
When I was testing our digital repository, I was essentially just trying to prove that I could find both. So I didn't try the other way around. So I'm not sure off the top of my head if, for example, using quotes would matter. So that's something I'll have to look into. I will note that we do, even though we're using lowercase d def when talking about the Clark School, if it's the beginning of the sentence, we'll use capital D def. So most of the time you probably want to be able to see both of them. But yeah, that's something for me to look into.
Another question, what sources are you using to determine which terms are current or outdated? And then I'm going to add on, and are you documenting the decisions that you're making regarding metadata?
So to look up terms, we often look if there's organizations that represent the people. For example, the National Association for the Deaf, which has a whole web page about different terminologies and which ones are outdated, which ones are offensive, which ones are up to each individual person's preference. And they explain their reasoning for that and all of that. So we kind of go to, if it's not addressed by the people who are talking in the papers that we're looking at, we go to the national associations or international associations that represent the people. And sometimes we'll look at different organizations and they conflict or they have different opinions of which terminology they prefer. But normally they agree on which terms are not okay to use. But no, I don't think, we haven't been documenting it.
Okay. So the next question is, what types of research questions do you get? Who are your users? Are they academics, disability ability advocates, community members?
The short answer is we get a mix of all of those using our collections. And so, yeah, we get all of disability activists, academics, all of them.
Okay. And then do you actively look for new materials or do individuals freely approach you with materials? And I will add, have you had to turn away any collections because they didn't fit your mandate?
It's a good question. It's kind of a mix of both. My colleagues who have been at UMass for 20-something years now have developed a lot of relationships with social activists. And so at this point, there are some collections that just come to us because their friend has their papers there and they thought that we'd be a great fit, things like that. And then sometimes we do reach out to people. In the case of this grant, the publicity of this grant led to a few different groups and people coming to us and asking if we'd be interested in their collections. For example, a scholar who studies the Paralympics and disability in sport heard about this grant and he asked if his collection would be a good fit, and we said yes. We brought it in. We have a pretty wide mandate. We collect things from a pretty broad categories. And so if something fits in those categories, we often take it unless there's some extenuating circumstances. So we don't turn away a lot of things if they're related to social change in any way.
Late coming in question, sorry. Would you be able to share your thoughts on the intersection of race and disability and perhaps how that has been documented within the project?
Well, for the most part, all of the people whose papers we have are all white, I'm pretty sure. So we don't have a lot of racial diversity in our collections, unfortunately. So I don't know how much I'll be able to talk about that. And that's obviously something we're aware of. And yeah.
Okay. I have a question for you. Can you tell us how often you've been asked to take materials down? And if you have, what were the circumstances?
For this project, we haven't had anyone has asked to take down. As far as I'm aware, UMass Special Collections history, we've had maybe one thing requested to take down, and I think it was someone's writing and they didn't like the format or something like that. It wasn't a privacy issue or anything like that. But for this project, so far, we've had nothing that anyone's requested to take down.
Thank you. We had a lot of questions, but we've gone through them all. So thank you very much, Kyle. We're now going to queue up for our next presenters.